What's going on, everybody? My name is Mark and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel for the first time. If you clicked into this video, then you'll be watching me 3D print and process a blaster from the Star Wars universe. Specifically, this item is known as none other than the EE-3 Carbine Rifle and has made several appearances throughout Star Wars canon and legends, but is most commonly recognized as the blaster of choice by this galaxy's most notoriously feared bounty hunter, Boba Fett. Just like in all of my videos, I have provided a link in the description where the STL files for this model can be purchased. This week's 3D model comes from galacticarmory.net, which is home to a plethora of mostly Star Wars related 3D files, but also sells raw prints for those that are interested in making their own cosplay weapons and armor, but don't own a 3D printer. If you're interested in the music selection for this video, I have annotated below where those videos can be found, as they are copyright free, so if you're working on your own Star Wars related video and you don't currently have a music score, check these videos out. Also, as shown on the screen, I'll go ahead and give a shout out to the 3 channels where that content was pulled from. Their channel links are included in the description below, so be sure to check them out as well. Moving on, I stated last week that the prop in this video is a commission for someone that I know personally. Well, since then, I have taken on another commission, and just like before, I have a sneak peek of my next video that I would like to show to all of you. Now, I have only done one other sword video prior to this, which I did thoroughly enjoy, but this one is significantly different in that it is respectively 5 feet in length from the tip of the blade to the base of the pommel. I'm referring to a sword known as Ichigo's Bankai from the anime Bleach. While taking into consideration how long the sword was and how many pieces it was broken up into, there were a couple of new techniques that I had to implement to ensure that this prop was adequately reinforced internally. If you're interested in seeing this, be sure to hit the notification bell so you'll be notified when that video is released. Now, just like how I start processing all of my 3D prints, I start by heavily sanding all surfaces with 80 grit sandpaper. The goal here is not to completely eliminate every single layer line, but rather to sand away a majority of them. Sanding at this stage may be exceptionally challenging, only because the material that you're trying to sand through is pretty tough material, especially if you're printing on PLA filament as opposed to PETG filament. Any remaining layer lines can be filled in during the following stages of production. Before we continue to remove or cover up layer lines, some general assembly of the model is in order. For this, there are 3 necessary materials. First, an adhesive strong enough to hold the model together. If anyone has seen any of my other videos, they would know that I am an avid user of 5-minute epoxy. Second, there are channels that run throughout the length of the model, so some sort of dowel can be inserted and glued into place so that the overall structural integrity of the model is improved. Whether you choose to go with an actual wooden dowel or something else like steel rod, it truthfully won't matter, as they both are still going to accomplish the same goal. Personally, I went with a threaded steel rod. The reason for choosing threaded as opposed to non-threaded steel rod is that there are plenty of grooves in threaded rod for 5-minute epoxy to sink into. With this one factor in mind, I find this to be much more superior. My reason for choosing steel over wood is that there's a weight factor. I wanted this model to be heavier and feel more real, and by using steel rod I was able to accomplish that. The diameters of the channels varying in size throughout this model are 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch, and threaded rod can be found at most local hardware stores such as Home Depot or Lowe's. Also be sure to allow your glue of choice to fully cure before handling. When covering up layer lines, it's always best to go with a sandable filler primer. Don't be afraid to apply this liberally, as any excess primer can just be sanded away again. You'll later come to understand that this is a precursor to a cycle in this process that can be potentially repeated indefinitely. any layer lines that are not completely filled in from this sandable filler primer can be filled in with Bondo glazing spot putty. This product takes roughly half an hour to dry before it can be sanded. Just be sure to wear gloves and a respirator when working with this material. But back to what I was saying, the steps in this repeated cycle are spray, putty, sand, and repeat. I've said this in previous videos, but the amount of time that you spend repeating this process greatly depends on how perfect you want your model to be. Typically, I'll repeat the spray, putty, sand cycle maybe 2 or 3 times, and any leftover imperfections are at that point embraced. For me, this works out because most of what I make is cosplay weaponry and armor, so small nicks and dents can actually be turned into quote-unquote battle damage. I mean, I'm 28 years old and I'm not getting any younger. I would rather not pull my hair out over trivial little imperfections such as that, but I digress. Life's too damn short. With any repeated sprays, you don't have to spray as heavily as you initially did, as you'll find that your model is covered in less and less imperfections. The same goes with applying putty as well. You'll notice that I didn't use nearly as much as I did the first time around. At this point, with each passing cycle, the amount of putty that you use will most likely be cut in half as your model inevitably inches towards the state of absolute perfection by your standards. When sanding at this stage, I recommend sanding with 320 grit sandpaper, as it is the perfect level of coarseness to leave most of the primer and putty flush with layer lines and not leave too deep of scratches in your model. You'll also come to find that this level of sanding is not nearly as unpleasant as it was when you sanded with 80 grit sandpaper. This is because you're only sanding through excess filler material as opposed to sanding through hard plastic. With that being said, not nearly as much pressure has to be applied to the model. If you do happen to apply too much pressure to what you're sanding, you may sand below some layer lines and then you'll have to fill them in again, followed by additional sanding. For only certain sections of this model, I wanted to produce a chipped paint effect, so naturally, I figured that a metallic undercoat would be a pretty logical choice. I made sure that the section that I wanted to paint was left exposed while the rest of the model was masked off. Then, with some Rustoleum Metallic finish spray paint, I gave this model a thorough once-over. After everything was completely dry, the tape and plastic coverings could be removed as it was time to apply a masking liquid to the areas that I wanted to appear as chipped. To do this, I used toothpaste as a masking liquid and I applied it with a toothpick. Once everything is masked off, a second layer of paint in a different color would be applied on top of the metallic finish. Then when that layer dries, the areas that had masking liquid on them can be wiped away, giving off the impression that the paint is chipped. I have utilized this same technique before, but in a much greater capacity. If anyone is interested in hearing me go into much more extraneous detail about this layering technique, then go check out Let's Make a Boba Fett Helmet Part 3, where I paint 2 different variations of Boba Fett's helmet. To wipe away the masking fluid, or in my case toothpaste, I just used a damp washcloth. At least while doing this, I had some peace of mind knowing that it would leave my project smelling minty fresh. For anyone that is interested though, I have also annotated in the description a link where actual masking fluid can be purchased, among other suggested alternatives. If you think toothpaste was weird, I've heard that some people have even used mustard as an alternative as a masking fluid. I've never cared to try though. And now we move on to a rather messy phase of this project, and no, I'm not talking about what's happening on the screen at this very moment, I'm talking about what happens right after I finish masking off this prop. What I am referring to is a graphite rub, which is yet again another technique that I have utilized in some of my other videos, which is also my preferred method by which I enjoy replicating a metallic finish. And with a black base coat, we achieve a dark gunmetal tone which is just perfect for this project. Now even though I like how reflective this came out at this stage, I want this model to have a tarnished look, so later I will go over this again with a matte finish clear coat, but the graphite rubbed areas will still retain some of the metallic properties. I do feel obligated at this point to also encourage anyone watching to be safe and wear breathing protection while working with graphite powder. Graphite powder is exceptionally fine, and I'm certain that you wouldn't want to coat the inside of your lungs with that material. With a round detail brush, I take a moment to paint on some additional details. Specifically, the color that I'm using here is called Champagne Bronze. Another additional detail that I wanted to add to this model is for the scope to appear to have actual lenses. For this, I traced the ends of the scope onto some leftover tinted visor from a previous project. Once painting is complete, these will later be added to the ends of the scope. The next technique that I used was one that I pulled straight out of the elementary school playbook. I wanted this model to have areas that appeared to be rusted, and to achieve that texture, I first applied school glue to varying areas that already had exposed metallic finish, similar to how I applied masking liquid with a toothpick earlier. Then, on top of the school glue, I applied ground cinnamon. Once I was certain that the school glue had retained an adequate amount of cinnamon, I blew away the excess material, and I repeated the process until I was satisfied with the amount of added detail. Once the school glue had enough time to dry and was fused with the cinnamon, it left behind a rough, crusty texture similar to rust. However, the color still wasn't very convincing to me, so later on, I painted in some additional detail to really drive home the point that this prop is supposed to look rusted. You'll see that sequence closer to the end of the video. To go ahead and knock out the rest of the aerosol painting needed on this project, specifically for the scope, I went ahead and sprayed the scope down with some matte finish clear coat. It definitely gave it a much more flat, worn look, which is what I was going for, as well as providing an extra layer of protection for the cinnamon on the surface of the scope. Also, as you just witnessed, I popped the lenses into the scope that I cut out earlier, giving this part of the prop a much more convincing look. Hypothetically, let's say you choose to do the same thing. If you cut the lenses out wide enough in diameter, you shouldn't need to use any kind of glue to hold them into place. Just like the scope, the rest of the prop also got matte finish clear coat as well. As much as I love the reflective properties of graphite powder, I wanted this to have a tarnished look with some rust spots. Even with matte finish clouding the graphite, it will still retain some of the metallic properties. It's just easier to see in direct light. After that had enough time to dry, I took the opportunity to go ahead and install the scope onto the rest of the model. With as much spraying that had been performed thus far, I had to use one of the mounting screws to bore out all of the mounting holes before installing the scope. The scope is mounted with 8 points of contact, and there are 4 mounting holes on each end of the scope. Finally, we arrive at the last remaining task in this entire process, which I think adds a final layer of detail that really sets this off. I wanted to incorporate some additional color to the textured areas that I'm trying to pass off as rusted. To accomplish this, I first mixed together orange and brown acrylic paint together in a bowl, and then I diluted it with water. Then with a detail brush, I went ahead and went over all of the areas that I had textured with school glue and cinnamon, as well as areas that I had not textured. In varying spots, I intentionally allowed paint runs, giving it a rusted water effect. And that wraps up my process for making an EE-3 blaster from Star Wars. If you truly liked this content, then do me a favor by hitting that like button, hit the subscribe button, and then the notification bell so you'll be notified when I publish new content. As always, thanks for watching.